Hey, thanks for checking out the Nikhil Hogan Show. If you like the content, you can subscribe to it on most major podcast platforms, YouTube, or Facebook. I'm also writing a book on music education called Why Children Quit Music, and you can check out my website, nikhilhogan.com, for updates on when it's going to be released. If you're a parent who's interested in learning how best to help your children learn music, you can check out my company, Songbird Music Academy.com, and there are a ton of free articles, links, and resources for Neapolitan Partimento-based learning, and also the Barry Harris method if you're interested in learning jazz. Now, let's get to the show. Hey everyone, welcome back to the Nikhil Hogan Show, the show bringing you in-depth music conversations with the best musicians in the world. Joining me today on the show as co-host is my good friend, drummer, and educator, Christopher Jengolewski. Chris, how's it going, man?
I'm doing well.
All right, I'm so pleased to introduce my guest today, 6-time Grammy Award-winning trumpeter, Randy Brecker. Randy's worked with some of the biggest names in music. He was in the original lineup for Blood, Sweat, and Tears, the Horace Silver Quintet, Art Blakey's Jazz Messengers, Dreams, Hal Galper, and perhaps most notably, the celebrated jazz funk fusion group, the Brecker Brothers. As a session musician, Randy has appeared on hundreds of albums, including James Taylor, Paul Simon, Bruce Springsteen, Steely Dan, Frank Zappa, Jaco Pastorius, and many more. In 1994, Randy won his first Grammy for Best Contemporary Jazz Performance with Out of the Loop, and this was followed in 1997 with Into the Sun. The next Grammy was for Best Contemporary Jazz Album for 2003's album 34th and N Lex. He picked up his fourth Grammy with a win for Best Large Jazz Ensemble for Some Skunk Funk in 2006. His fifth for Best Contemporary Jazz Album in 2008, Randy in Brasil. In 2013, Randy's album Night in Calisia won the Grammy for Best Contemporary Jazz Album. Randy's also an 18-time Grammy nominee. As a solo recording artist, he's released over 20 albums. His latest album is 2019's Rocks, with the NDR Big Band, featuring performances by David Sanborn, Ada Rafati, and Frank Dell. Randy, it's really great to be able to talk to you today. Welcome to the show.
Well, thank you. Thank you. It was a good introduction. Sounds like you're talking about somebody else.
Well, okay, so I wanted to ask you about, your father. You've described him, and he seems to be a very good musician from how you've described him. He played the piano, he sang, he wrote songs, he was a big fan of Clifford Brown. Did he teach you growing up as well?
Well, he didn't teach me directly as far as anything out of books, but he helped my ear immensely. He was an ear player. He could just hear a tune and play it. He wasn't a really good reader, but he was an expert songwriter, player, singer, sang great. When I was 2 years old, he wrote a tune for me, 2 weeks old, called The Hottest Man in Town, and he forecast that I'd play a horn, maybe a hot fife, and love music even more than my wife. So I think my future was foretold in that tune. And he had musicians over the house all the time, listened constantly to records as soon as he got home from work. He was a lawyer by trade first, but he was really a musician first. He went to camps with other songwriters. He was close with people like Moose Charlap, Bill Charlap's dad. Moose wrote Peter Pan and other Broadway writers, Bobby Troup, and his songs were really as good as any of them. He could have been a professional songwriter.
Speaking of good ears, do you have absolute or perfect pitch yourself?
Well, I have pretty good relative pitch, as they call it. I can usually come pretty close, and if I've been playing trumpet, I have really pretty good ears. I can hear most of the chord changes going by, and the ones I miss, I work on those tonalities. I kind of always go back and try to figure out what chords I didn't hear when I try to learn a new tune. I always try to do it by ear, and invariably it's a lot of the same tonal centers, so I work on those. Like in the A-flat area on trumpet is hard to distinguish for me between the D-flat area, and strangely enough, E minor 7 to A7 I have trouble hearing, so I work on those tonal centers as part of my practice routine.
When you were a kid and you picked up the trumpet, how many hours did you practice a day?
Well, I think I was allotted 45 minutes to practice my classical studies. And I remember sometimes I had a pencil and pad out counting down the minutes that I could get to my record collection and play along with records. That's mostly how I learned how to play, aside from playing downstairs with my father, who would teach me by ear tunes. But I had a brilliant idea when I was about 10 years old to take some of his records up to my room and just play along. And I started with ballads like in 1955, Miles Davis had released Roundabout Midnight, his first album on Columbia, and I learned that tune, Round Midnight, the great Monk tune. And there was a Chet Baker, Jerry Mulligan record where they played My Funny Valentine. I learned that one. And there was also a Shorty Rogers record that had some kind of easier tunes on, and that was one of the first records my late great brother played along with. He started on clarinet, and Jimmy Drufy was also on that record. So we both played along with Martians Come Back, which was the Shorty Rogers record.
So you guys chose your instruments when you were quite young. Did you have a teacher? Like, were you in school band, or were you self-taught? I mean, how did you learn to improvise outside of just like listening to albums? Did you have like a band director or someone that helped you?
Well, it's a good question. And at that point, we both started when we were 8. Mike was 3 years younger than I, and we were sadly only a block out of the Philadelphia city limits. Philadelphia had a pretty good music program in a lot of the schools, particularly in Northeast Philadelphia, but we were just out of that area, so we were officially in suburban Philadelphia, and the grade school didn't really have a very good music program, but they did have trumpets or clarinets available. I grabbed the trumpet. I was older, 3 years ahead of him, and Mike didn't want to play the same instrument, so as he put it, he got kind of stuck with the clarinet. But we did both study with wonderful players from the Philadelphia Orchestra. Myself was Sigmund Herring, who was a very well-known pedagogue. Beside being a fine trumpet player, a lot of his books are still available. In fact, I still practice out of some of his books. He also taught Wallace Roney, who came along a little later. And Mike studied with a wonderful clarinetist from the Philadelphia Orchestra named Leon Lester. So we did have classical training, and Dad would, like I say, after we got done our lessons, he was usually home on Saturday, and we'd go play some tunes like Our Love Is Here to Stay, or he taught us Lullaby of Birdland by ear, counseled us to always keep the melody in the back of our head and play around the melody. But as far as studying officially jazz, that had to wait. Believe it or not, until I got to Indiana University and started to study with Dave Baker. But in the interim, I had transcribed solos. I got familiar with the piano. I transcribed some Monk and some Bill Evans voicings, and Dad would show me things, and I watched his hands. So we had a kind of a family band. He bought a set of vibes that Mike and I doubled on. My sister was a bass player, and now she plays harp, but she was a wonderful classical pianist. And both Mike and I doubled on drums. So we had a little family band beside everything else.
We're actually curious, did you use solfege or numbers when learning melodies, or was it just the pure notes? Did you write out the transcriptions, or is it something you kept in your head, like your dad was saying, keeping the melody in your head?
Yeah, no, my trumpet teacher later, Tony Marcione, who was from the Philadelphia Music Academy, and the first call trumpet teacher in Philly and trumpet player as far as doing shows, and he was the busiest guy. He was an expert solfeggio guy, but I was never really taught that. So when I transcribed or heard stuff, I just kind of heard the note. I think it's a good thing to learn those solfeggio. And in retrospect, I wished I had had that kind of education, but I didn't.
Could you also name some of those books that you were using as a kid, some of those practice etudes, the classical ones and maybe the jazz ones as well?
Well, the main ones are intermediate exercises by Sigmund Herring, because he liked to play out of his books. But then I graduated. I mean, the Bible of the trumpet is the Arbenz book, if you ask any trumpet player. So that was the main book, the Schlossberg book, various are some other ones. Herbert L. Clark, his 3 or 4 books. These are all well-known trumpet pedagogue books that can help you become a better player. Top Tones for Trumpet by Walter Smith. I think those, in a nutshell, were the books mostly that I played out. It's a Charlie A. Etude book. But, it was funny when my teacher, Sigmund Herring, I was probably by then about 9 or 10, he was trying to help my jazz. He knew I had an interest in jazz. So he also brought a book home called Sketch Orcs by Bugs Bauer, the popular jazz tunes of the day, written out in dotted 8/16 notes generally. And Mr. Herring gave me a lecture about syncopation and with his Viennese accent. But by listening and playing along with records, I had kind of learned how to, without really even thinking about it, by listening to good jazz players, I had kind of learned how to swing in that fashion and doodle tongue and articulate away from the classical tradition just by listening. So records were also really valuable as a tool.
So you were around a lot of classical musicians in Philadelphia or Pennsylvania. Your father was obviously introducing you to a lot of great music. But did you ever watch any live jazz musicians while you were there before you went to Indiana? Because you said you really started getting into jazz more when you were in Indiana as far as like formal training. And But did you get to see any players while you were still like in high school?
Oh, sure. I started seeing players when I was 5 or 6 years old because Dad would take me to clubs. Heard Dizzy. I just heard, not to be generalized, but I heard just about everyone. Dizzy, Miles. He'd drive up to New York. I remember hearing Miles at the 5 Spot, or what was the name of it? I think it was called the Jazz Gallery on 3rd Avenue with J.J. Johnson and Hank Mobley as the front line. I heard Miles also at a place called the Red Hill Inn, which was in Red Hill, New Jersey, right outside of Philadelphia, with the classic band with Train and Cannonball and Wynton Kelly and then Philly Joe and Paul Chambers. But unfortunately, Train didn't show up for that one, but we had a front row seat. I was 2 feet from Miles, so it was a thrill. Carmen McRae, Dave Brubeck, Charles Mingus. I heard just about everyone. And I was just thrilled. I thought jazz musicians were the coolest thing in the world.
Are there any vivid memories of these performances? Are they all very vivid, clear in your mind? Any stand out for you particularly?
Well, the Miles one did because he had no cuffs in his pants and he was tailored so well. And to get in tune, he'd stick his finger in his ear when he was playing. Little things like that, little gestures stick in my mind. And, of course, the sound. I remember hearing Dizzy once, and he had forgot to put oil in his valve, so his second valve stuck, and he kind of quizzically looked at the audience and held up his horn because they had to stop playing, and everybody laughed. And it was also so funny. He introduced in between tunes. This goes way back when Sonny Liston was the heavyweight champ. Dizzy said, "Ladies and gentlemen, I want to introduce a special guest that is here tonight. His name is Sonny Liston, the heavyweight champion." And everyone looked around and started applauding. And then Dizzy went, "Oh, pardon me, madam." So that was one of his stuff. But I thought that was the funniest thing I had ever heard. And I also heard, comedians, Lenny Bruce. When I was a kid, I was really ahead of my time. I was a hip kid.
Did your father, was he very particular in his taste for trumpet players? I know you mentioned he's a huge fan of Clifford Brown. How did his taste in trumpet playing vary?
Well, he was a Clifford Brown fan because Clifford, being from Wilmington, his home base when he formed the group with Max Roach, sadly, those years right before he was sadly killed. And I remember the day that he passed away when Dad read about it at breakfast. That's how vivid a lot of this stuff is. It was just a terrible day. So Clifford was first, but he knew Dizzy somewhat. Whenever we would see Dizzy, he would wave at Dad. And his tastes were bebop, and he didn't like classical music. He said it all sounded the same. And for a while, I believed him. Now I know that was kind of a prejudicial comment. Right. He was strictly a bebopper. And smart guy, really, really well read, but he did have opinions about things. But he loved jazz. He loved Lee Morgan was also a local guy from Philly who also took lessons from Tony Marcion, my trumpet teacher. There was a great tradition. All these guys were still living in Philly, so we would go hear local guys, the Heath brothers, and Billy Root became a friend who was a wonderful saxophonist who played with Dizzy's band and ended up in Las Vegas. He started utilizing me when I was a little older in his octet. There was a guy named Clarence C. Sharp, who was a underground altoist, kind of cross between Bird and Ornette, who played on Lee's first records, and I started to play with him. Dad would actually, when I got a little older, would take me around and have me sit in with local musicians. He was a champion of us. So I was very lucky in that respect that I often say to myself, you should play way better than you do since you were in these great circumstances. But I try.
Well, now, when you were 15, Randy, in 1959, you went to Indiana University to play in Stan Kenton's band camp. Now, what was that experience like?
Well, that was just great. I read about the band camp in Downbeat magazine. He had that thing going for 3 or 4 years. And Dad and Mom gave me the permission to get on a bus. It was a 14-hour trip to Bloomington, Indiana. And strangely enough, I remember I sat down next to another trumpet player who was also going out to the camp, who was more of a lead player. I forget his name. But it's funny, these things you remember. And we got there. I stayed in the dorms. My trumpet instructor was the great Marvin Stamm. Stan Kenton's full band was there. Cannonball Adderley Sextet with Yusef and Nat and Joe Zawinul and Sam Jones and Lewis Hayes. Donald Byrd was there. Charlie Mariano, I think he probably was playing with Stan at that time. But just imagine being around all those guys as a 15-year-old. And I was a pretty good player, even at 15, basically playing by ear. So I got in what they called the headband, which was led by John Laporta, where there was no music besides the regular band, big band, which was led by Marvin, where we did read music, and I was struggling reading. I was always I got to be a good reader in college. I really worked on it. But I met other students there. It's fascinating. Dave Sanborn, we're all the same age, 14 or 15, 16. Lou Marini, a good friend of mine, Mitch Farber, who became active in the jingle world and was close friends with Donald Byrd. Keith Jarrett was there. It's funny, he's in the picture, but none of us knew it because he never talked to anybody. So that's where we met a lot of friends that I'm still close to. It was really a formidable, only there 2 weeks, I think. It was a 2-week program. I got to know Marvin really well, and just to hear these great trumpet players and the Stan Kenton big band every night they played, or Cannonball played, or you'd be in a room with these guys, it was just, you had to pinch yourself.
Do you think being exposed to all these great musicians, not just listening to it, but playing with them and having your dad have you sit in and going to these camps, do you think it helped you gain confidence, or were you just too young to really know that fear of playing with like this level of a musician? How do you think that affected you, having that exposure at such a young age?
Well, I think it only helped, and it did help, I guess, my confidence, although I don't know of any musician that is supremely confident. You always wonder if the next note's going to come out, especially being a trumpet player. That's sad but true. But I did get a notion that people were enjoying what I did. I got placed in a band. We had also a small group with Sanborn. And even back then, we kind of had similar conception. Similar personalities. We really hit it off together. So when we started the Brecker Brothers band, just years later, he was first on the list to be the part of the horn section. And I still play with Marini all the time. He was, back then, probably the most professional out of all of us. His father was a full-time musician in, where is he from? Dallas or Houston, I forget which. And back then, Marini played all the woodwinds. He was a total pro.
I want to talk about your time at the Indiana University. Now, is it true that there was a situation where 30% of some students flunked a theory class because of a professor or something? Could you talk about that?
Oh, yeah. Well, that's not a well-known fact, but yes, I flunked traditional theory. And looking back on it, I think there was probably something wrong with the way he was teaching. But yes, it is true that might even have been more, that close to half the class flunked. So I think there was something wrong with his teaching method. But at the same time, I was driving to Indianapolis, which is about an hour drive from the campus, and studying finally with a jazz harmony and phrasing, etc., with the great Dave Baker before he ended up at the school and headed the program. And I played in his band, and he helped me immensely with my reading. And I was playing a lot of pretty complicated stuff by ear, half-tone, whole-tone, diminished scales, altered scales, but I didn't know how to codify what I was playing. So he would say, no, what you're playing is this, and he'd write it down and started teaching me. He was a fan and, of course, a band member of the great George Russell, and taught modal harmony, like all coming out of George Russell's teaching. So he taught me about modes. We studied monk tunes. We studied what could be called, he called it intervallic approach, where we'd pick apart tunes intervallically, and I'd have to improvise on the prevalent intervals of whatever tune we were doing. So he was invaluable in helping me.
Can I ask you this question, Randy, about theory? Since you were pretty self-taught and you kind of organically came to music, what's your opinion of music theory in general? Can you give your take on how someone should look at theory?
Well, I think you have to learn it and get near a piano. So I had to fill in a lot of holes, and I'm still filling in the holes on my own by still playing the piano, and I go through various jazz theory books to this day. There's one, the Jazz Piano book by Mark. Here, I'll go with names again. I'll have to look this up. Jazz Piano, Jazz Theory book is names on the tip of my tongue, and those books are downstairs, unfortunately. But the main thing is I take books and read them now. As far as, it took a long time, for instance, before I learned about melodic minor modes. I somehow Dave Baker we didn't get into that part of modal playing. It was all in major, do, re, mi, fa, sol, la, ti, do modes. So I'm constantly just learning, and I recommend, start with theory as much as you can, but also play as much as you can. It's a combination of both intellect and your ear, obviously. So the more you know about both, I always depend on my ear. I still enjoy doing that. I sometimes do better if I'm not looking at the changes. It's a strange thing. In fact, I did a session. It's funny you brought that up. Just last week, we do a lot of home file sharing stuff. And I did a session for my good friend Niels Landoki, who's in Copenhagen. We did a Christmas tune, Let It Snow, written by Sammy Kahn, whose son Steve is a good friend of mine. Imagine the money Sammy made off of that tune. So, and I couldn't find the lead sheet. It turned out he had sent it to me, but I hadn't printed it out. And it wasn't a hard tune, so I just played the solo by ear. I could kind of figure out what the changes were. After which I did find the lead sheet, and if I had the lead sheet and if I had been reading the changes, I wouldn't have had as good a solo as I came up with, because it was totally off the top of my head, based off the melody, playing melodically, lyrically. So there's something to be said for both, but I still do like to, pin back the changes in the back of my mind and know what they are, but to try to forget about them at the same time, if you know what I mean.
We actually like to talk a little bit about how you write music now. So we have all this background on how you learned. Now we want to get into, in the early 70s, you started working with Billy Cobham, and during those years, you started to write for yourself. And I was, wondering kind of what that process was like. You had an electric piano you'd use, I guess, and you'd fool around with scores. What did you mean by, fooling around with musical scores?
Well, I studied some scores. I'm not sure where you got that quote from, but I would fool around just on the piano, really. But I wrote everything. You had to write scores. There was no other way to to write music so that other people could see what you were doing. This was in the early 70s, and yes, I was playing with Billy Cobham, but I started to think about writing a couple of years earlier in the band Dreams, which we had. We had 2 records out on Columbia. And on the second Dreams record, I wrote a couple kind of weird pop tunes. I actually wrote lyrics to them, too. But I didn't really seriously think about doing a whole project until during the Billy Cobham years, and Sanborn had moved to town. Of course, I had been playing with my brother for years with Billy and with Dreams, and other friends had come to town, and one who I forgot to mention earlier was Don Grolnick, who I also met at the band camp. We became friendly with him. I had called up a young bass player from Miami to audition for Dreams. His name was Will Lee. He got the gig in 2 seconds and never went back to Miami, and we're still playing together all these years later. And Chris Parker on drums, great drummer, Harvey Mason. I had formulated a band that I wanted to write for. Steve Kahn on guitar, but strangely enough, Sammy Kahn's son, who I just mentioned. A lot of the guys lived in the same kind of loft apartment building. We'd have rehearsals, and I assiduously sat at the piano for hours a day. I was doing a lot of session work as a trumpet player, so I couldn't come home and practice. I wanted to save my chops for the sessions. It was really like a hobby. I'd sit at the piano. On top of the piano, I had a clavinet. I had played with Stevie Wonder for about 9 months in 1973, too. Not many people know about that. So he was an invaluable source for inspiration and love of the clavinet. I went on the road with him. Sanborn was in the horn section.
Could you talk a little bit more about that? I mean, I wasn't aware of that either. Just that experience, those 9 months you spent with Stevie Wonder.
Yeah, well, I was close to the guys in the band, particularly Sanborn, and their trumpet player. Unfortunately, Steve Medeo sadly passed away a couple months ago. But he had a drinking problem back in those days, and one day he had, after finishing off his mini bar in the hotel, he did a concert with Stevie and fell off the stage and fractured his skull, sadly. He became sober after that and was sober the rest of his life, actually. I was friends with him until he sadly passed away just several months ago. But because I was friendly with guys in the band, particularly Sanborn, they called me. I was free at the time. So I took his place for about 9 months. We traveled all over the U.S. in cars, played at the Apollo for a week. Great band with Sanborn, Ray Parker Jr. on guitar, Ollie Brown on drums, classic. Stevie was Superstition, and that whole record had just come out, so we played that stuff every night. It was so inspiring just to hear the perfection with which he performed every night. So that also broadened my interest to want to write and just organize all the musical thoughts I was having in my head. That was quite a 9-month period.
So that must have been a big influence on you getting into sort of like funk and R&B, obviously playing with Cobham before too, but starting with so much like jazz and classical focus. And then I was always really curious about how you got into, like rock, funk, R&B, fusion. And it seems like this all kind of fed into that inspiration, that transformation.
Yeah, it's true. And Philadelphia was a potpourri of different styles of music. Of course, it was a great jazz town, as you well know. Coltrane lived there during his formative years. Dizzy Gillespie lived there during his formative years. All these great jazz musicians, like I mentioned, the Heath brothers, I could just go on and on. When I was growing up, all these local guys were around. It was the birthplace of Jimmy Smith and B3 organ trios. All that came out of Philadelphia. It was a great blues town, R&B, soul town, with the advent of a lot of recording was going on. Philly, I was too young to do it, but a lot of the jazz musicians, and this is the thing that I want to impart, kind of knew how to get further than just being a jazz musician. So a lot of the jazz musicians that I knew were part of the recording that was going on, and the recording all had to do with pop music or soul music or R&B, Chubby Checker and the Twist, all that stuff. Parkway, Cameo Parkway, which led into Philly International, Gamble and Huff scouring the city for young talent and singers and finding guys. Dick Clark, I don't know if you're familiar with American Bandstand, which eventually made its way to Hollywood. That all emanated in Philadelphia, and he was a big jazz fan. What I learned was jazz musicians that were behind a lot of the pop music coming out of Philly, well, they were all jazz musicians, as a matter of fact. I didn't really know the extent till I kind of researched it later, that a lot of the guys I would go out and hear, guys that you probably don't even know their names, but all great jazz musicians, saxophonist Buddy Savitt, a great vibraphonist named Vince Montana, a wonderful pianist named Jimmy Wisner. They were all producers of all amazing R&B and soul music that came out of Philly. Dick Clark discovered guys like, I don't know if you know these names, Frankie Avalon, Bobby Rydell. They were also jazz music. Frankie Avalon was a good jazz trumpet player who went to school with Lou Tabak. Frankie Avalona was his real name, and Bobby Rydell, Bobby Ritterelli, was a jazz drummer. So there was all this cross-pollination in Philly where guys were known as one thing, but were jazz musicians, really. So I caught on to that idea of, grew in my head that that there's a way to package what we do. I think I didn't realize I was thinking like that when I was that young, but I was around it so much that it just fostered that in the back of my head.
Well, Randy, let me ask you about your compositional process. Now, let me read you a quote. You said, "I'm completely self-taught. I just learned by sitting at the piano and figuring out voicings and just writing and recording everything on a daily basis." How long did it take you to develop your craft of composition?
Well, it was years, and I go back to when I was playing with Horace Silver and we were doing a TV show and he got interviewed. It was called For Blacks Only. I was thrilled to be on there. Muhammad Ali was also interviewed. I have a good story about that. Okay. I'll tell you that story because it's pretty cool. For the show was For Blacks Only, and there was a door on the set that they called For Blacks Only, was written over it. And Horace and Muhammad Ali walked through the door. And I was kidding around after the show was over, and I walked through the door. And Muhammad Ali saw me walk through the door and kidding around said, "Hey," and he started walking towards me with his fists up like he used to do, like kidding around. Was one of the most thrilling moments of my life. He saw me walk through the door. He was such a wonderful man. But Horace also gave a long interview to the interviewer. And the interviewer asked him the same question, how does he write? And he described it like putting a giant puzzle together. And for me, that sunk in. And that indeed was what it was like for the most part. For 80% of the time, like I said, I had I had started to play the piano, or at least fool around with voicings at a younger age, where like I previously mentioned, transcribing monk tunes and monk voicings. I graduated and tried to, once again, starting with ballads, tried to transcribe Bill Evans voicings.
Well, actually, Randy, let's take an example maybe from your first album with the Brecker Brothers. How would a song like Some Skunk Funk come about in a compositional, how did it gestate in your mind?
Okay, well, that's a good question, and I can kind of go through it in detail. Now, that was a huge puzzle because I would record everything I wrote. I'd sit at the piano for hours or the clavinet trying to get a groove going or try to get something that I liked. And if I liked something, I'd record it. And assiduously, I would mark the recording. Now, this was all cassettes. I didn't even have a 4-track yet. I got a 4-track when we went to Japan the first time. So I would piggyback playing ping pong back and forth between two cassette players. I'd get a vamp going on the piano. I'd record it on one. Then I'd play the vamp and I'd play a melody on the second cassette recorder. But it was like putting a giant puzzle together and utilizing different instruments. And just to go over, I think this would be a good example. The intro, which is okay, probably you know that because it's became a well-known tune. Let me go over each bar, and you'll see what I mean. Because each bar I played on a different day on a different instrument, and I filed it away and I put it together. Eventually, that became an intro. For instance, the I played on trumpet one day. I still do that. I play alone. I try to play just off the top of my head, intervallically or rhythmically, things. My brother would do that just to come up with new melodies or new licks that I can apply to the piano. And I remember I was sitting in the dining room table, and that came out, and I said, well, that's pretty cool. It kind of sounds a little like Miles's mode, but let me write those notes down. So I wrote down filed it away. The bub-a-dip, bub-a-dip, those were two different instruments. The triplet was a clavinet part. You know, Stevie, my years with Stevie, I could watch him play clarinet, and I loved that instrument. And I would always be playing triplet. Also, Billy Preston. I had seen him live a couple times, and he was around playing a lot. So that that was played on clarinet. Clarinet, of course, it was longer, but the idea of bub-a-dip. So I filed that away. The kind of deep, sharp nine chords. That was another day on my Suitcase Rhodes. So those first three bars were three different instruments on three separate days. And I kind of pieced them together. And I forget the order how I put this together. What come the bit, which is probably the hippest part of the intro, was an accident. It was kind of a bleed through on the cassette playing from another take. I had played, so I have which was a keyboard. That was an accident. It was just on the cassette player. Da, sharp nine chord, and then the I went back to the trumpet, and I had that line somewhere laying around on another cassette. And somehow I put that together, and that became the intro. I didn't know it was even going to be an intro at that point. So it just shows you how piecemeal writing can be.
Wow, it's really impressive that it was all these different instruments. I mean, I would never
would
have guessed that.
Yeah, that's wild, huh? Yeah, it's wild. And then, of course, then I came up with the rest of it. The bump, which was the basis of the tune, was a clavinet line. So I recorded that, and then I recorded the melody on trumpet over that. The bridge, this is another kind of good, interesting story, which the rhythmic thing is Don Grolnick, who lived around the corner, would come over and play my piano quite a bit, and he was learning how to play like Richard T. at that point, because Richard T. was such a great keyboard artist. We were big fans. We'd go hear him whenever we could. And Richard would play that rhythm all the time on the piano. And Grolnick would come over and play different chords. But I said, well, man, that'll be a good. So I started out with that rhythm. I think it was a G chord, and I kind of subtly, each time it came around, I added a little tension to the basic chord to make it go kind of outside a little more. So that's why it repeats, and that was a good method to start with something simple and then add tension, utilizing the same triad but some half steps and just things to make it rub a little more. So then I started to get the nucleus of a tune, and once you have something going, it becomes easier. You know, you can start fooling around with an arrangement. Another thing that's kind of interesting that comes to my head, I knew I wanted a break in the tune sooner or later, and that came about by listening. This tune has absolutely nothing to do other than that was my reason for wanting a break. There's a Herbie Hancock tune called Blind Man, Blind Man, off his first record. And in the middle of a tune, Blind Man, which is a really soulful, funky tune. It goes, bam, 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 oh, bo-do-no-no-no. That was the break. And I thought that was really cool. So I wanted something like that in Skunk Funk. And believe it or not, the bam, bam, da-da-da-do-da-da-da-da, the inspiration behind that started out as a simple break that I developed. But the idea behind that was Herbie Hancock's Blind Man. So all these different things come into the tune while you're recording it, while you're composing it. And I find it just fascinating. And that's generally how a lot of the stuff I wrote happened. I'd go out and hear music purposely to try to just get inspired, maybe come home with a certain feel I had heard. I remember hearing at McKell's, a good friend of mine, Denny Morales, who was also tenor saxophonist when I was on the road with Stevie. He was the third horn. And he played kind of an out shuffle, and that became the inspiration for a tune of mine, Inside Out. I said, I need a tune like that. So these were all methods that I utilize. You have to get out there and kind of live it to write it.
Well, I have to ask you about one tune. It's a favorite of mine, and I've always been really curious about how you went about writing this. It's very interestingly layered. The tune Sponge. Could you talk a little about how you put that piece together?
Well, that was around that same time period, and my recollection, this one I have to think more about because I don't talk about it that much, but I think I had the keyboard part kind of nailed first. And the idea was to have a little poly, it's all kind of funky stuff out of James Brown, a lot of it, but I tried to utilize polytonality. If I was in F, I'd use some like triads a step above. That's all I was thinking at the time. And to try to take it outside a little. And the horn parts came later in the melody. By then, I might have had one more. No, I didn't. It was still pretty much those instruments. I have to sing it to myself, even though we play it all these times. And that was also a pretty long process. But the main thing was I had the I could play that on the piano. All the stuff that I wrote at the time, I could play the keyboard part on the piano. I could play piano well enough, and that goes for most of my tunes. And the keyboard was really, on most of the tunes, was the nucleus where I got the ideas. And then the boom, 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 there was kind of a Lydian thing that goes back to my lessons with Dave Baker, as does Skunk Funk. That's kind of a Lydian scale. And doodle tonguing, we doodle tongue some of it, we single tongue some of it. So it's a combination of so many influences. It was just information being poured into my body that I was pouring out at the same time. And the bridge was pure James Brown. Boom, boom, ba ba da 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 da. Oh,
it's interesting that you chose how did you come up with the groove for that part? Like you're saying it's James Brown, but there's sort of like this, boom, da 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 da. It almost kind of like feels like the beat turns around. It's really interesting.
Well, it's the way we played it, and then we started fooling around with it when we played it live, Mike and I, and we lay back way on the beat, so we played it boom boom da 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 da. So the guys, I utilized a lot of other guys' input. In fact, I can't take credit for. No, I think that was me. I wrote that, but the boom 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 boom. Boom, boom. That, I think we jammed that part up. I don't think that was in the original charts. Too long ago to remember. Most of the tune I had written myself, but the band helped with the arrangement. Will and Grolnick.
Now, just switching gears a little bit, you're at the forefront of contemporary jazz. Where do you see jazz moving to now, musically, rhythmically, harmonically, melodically?
Well, that ain't an easy question to answer there, boys. I usually coin the term, and it's someone else's. It came from Jack DeJohnette, multi-directional. It's a good way to get out of a specific answer. But It's all encompassing now. You just think, I'm in outside New York City and Long Island, and you're in Singapore, and we have all these commonalities that we can talk about, and that goes for anywhere. I travel all over the world, in China, Russia, Siberia. Jazz is all over the place. So I think the fact that it's been so globalized, that's a big influence. As Joe Zawinul said years ago when I heard him live at the Blue Note, people don't look to America to, as far as jazz being American. It's really globalized, and a lot of other influences have come into the music. So that's number one. Number two is the advent and the expertise of jazz education, which is also globalized. You can go to China now and go from city to city for a month. There's schools in every small town, every city. I've been invited, to come over for a month and just teach in various schools. 20 years ago, there were none of that. When Mike and I went to China in 1992, there was absolutely nobody who knew how to play. There were no schools. We were invited to some local jam sessions, and believe me, there was nobody that had a clue.
Oh.
Now you go to China.
It's still like
well, there's plenty of great players there now. And there's a burgeoning jazz scene in many cities in China. So it's become globalized. There's education all over the world where maybe you get too much education, but there's intermingling of cultures. I think that has a big effect. Still in pop music, there's still a lot of jazz is behind the scenes, but what's his name? Anthony Pack, the drummer. A lot of the hip hop guys love jazz, and that has an influence. Of course, African American culture always comes up with something new, so I always keep an eye on that.
Are you still studying music? And if so, what things are you working on specifically?
Well, what I do, and I think what all musicians do, of course, every time I pick up my instrument, being the fact that it's a trumpet, and it's a difficult instrument to play, that's always a study. Even when I'm just improvising or playing with records downstairs, which I still do to keep my chops up, I have to concentrate on so many things technically to be able to play the instrument. But I'm always, and this is probably the most important part of what I do, I try to broaden my vocabulary and what I can fall back on, my for lack of a better word, my licks. Let's just simplify it. By trying to write new lines and trying to get to a piano and work new figures into my improvisations. Maybe they might be just some kind of melody that kind of works, or just some kind of finger exercise that works, or some pattern that I've come up with, like the Skunk Funk first 8 notes. Mike did that a lot too. I just turn everything off. I just play. And sometimes I come up with great stuff on the instrument. Sometimes I don't. I usually try and record whatever I play, just like I did when I was younger, recording everything on cassettes. Now I do it into my computer. But music is a constant, it's just a constant learning process. And if you want to keep playing, that's a big part of it.
Now, Randy, as we come to the end of the interview, I like to do some fun questions. So these are not your answers don't have to be really serious. I'm just going to ask you things like who are your top 3 this, top 3 that, and just whatever comes to mind. You ready?
Okay.
Yeah,
you got it.
So who are your top 3 saxophone players?
Well, that's not a hard one to answer. My top 3 are number 1, I must say Michael Brecker, who was such a big influence. We talk about who the greatest of all. I don't use the word great, but of course I was so close to him. I have to mention Coltrane, who was such an influence. My brother would say in 100, 200 years, people are still going to know who Coltrane is, and I think he's right. The more time goes by, the more important Coltrane's music and his outlook toward life becomes to me, and I'm not even a saxophonist. And of course, I have to mention number 3, who is my lovely wife, who I have such a great relationship with, and I'm not saying that because she's my wife. I'm very proud of her. She has her own thing going as a saxophonist. We just recorded 10 of her tunes, and she's been, it's a new record called Brecker Plays Rovati. I wanted to introduce the public. She's been writing for years and putting out records, but people always assume I'm just doing it because she's my wife, but she is a great player. And many musicians on the New York area know it, and she plays in our Brecker Brothers band reunion when we do it. Always gets the most applause of anyone. And she's working hard. So they would be the top 3. But behind them, there's about 300 others because I listen a lot. From Coleman Hawkins and Lester Young onward.
What about your top 3 drummers?
Well, I must say Mike was a good drummer too, the swinging guy. To have a quick story, and then I was playing at the North Sea Jazz Festival in a jam session, and good drummer, I forget who it was, started out the tune. In the middle of the tune, I heard the drummer change. Like it was in the middle of my solo, and I said to myself, this guy is really swinging. And I finished my solo, looked behind me, and there's Mike playing drums. So, but in what we do, let me think. This will take a quick second. Of course, Elvin, Tony or Billy Cobham. I had a long relationship with Billy Cobham, and I don't think he gets enough credit for literally starting the jazz rock fusion way of playing. And I was there when he started it. Even more importantly than Tony, because everyone plays like Billy now, Dennis Chambers, et cetera, et cetera. So I'd have to say Billy was really a big influence on me and music at the time. And I happened to be I'm not trying to promote it, but I happened to be going out on tour with him next week. Number 3 for me, and I guess this is strictly selfish, but I love Bernard Purdie on the funk side. I used him on my first record, and I just played with him a couple months ago. He's 80-something, still in the pocket like a mofo. So those are 3 different styles of drummer. Billy can play any style. You know, we played together in Horace's band, and I saw him and heard him listen to Ginger Baker and saw that whole thing develop firsthand, how he added drums, started lifting weights, and just, you know, his influence was undeniable. And everybody loves Elvin as a drummer first. Boy, that's so airy and in the pocket.
Now, how about top 3 keyboard or piano players?
Well, okay, we'll leave my father out of it. But let me think. Well, we can't not mention Bill Evans, who was such a big influence on piano, Chick Corea, and Herbie Hancock. Those are my maybe top 3 that I still listen to and were such great inspirations. And, you know, piano goes way back to the beginning, and I love older styles, too. And Monk, I can't leave Monk out. I say was such a big influence, just the essence. And I think if you ask both Herbie and especially Chick who their inspiration was, they would say Monk.
Now, what about this is probably the most difficult question, the top 3 trumpet players?
Well, that's a hard one, you know, because, you know, as musicians, we don't think a top, we look at, you know, individual playing, and a trumpet is such a individualistic instrument with the sound and everything. It's almost impossible. But I suppose the guy with the most influence that knew how to kind of always forge ahead was, of course, Miles. Not that he changed his style that much, but he changed his surroundings. He was able to do that and put great bands together. But you can't forget about Dizzy, who early records just was, you know, he just started bebop. He was so intelligent, and he had so much in the way of technique. He had just everything. He was a great entertainer. He was an undeniable influence. Without him, none of us would be here. Number 3, let's see, a personal thing. I love Kenny Dorham. The way he slots his notes, the way he gets to the meat of the changes. So I still listen a lot to him. I don't know if they're the top, and then there's 300 other guys behind them that I love.
Right. Now, who do you think, in your opinion, top 3 arrangers for horn sections, or people who are the best writers for horn sections?
Oh, boy, you guys. Okay, well, I'll tell you, on the R&B side, I just spent a night listening to Maceo Parker with Fred Wesley and Pee Wee Ellis on YouTube, and they were so great. And those three guys I always think of as a horn section. They influenced both me and Mike in their writing and their playing and conception so much. So the JB Horns, I forget what their title was, but those three guys were fantastic as far as, and Fred in particular, Fred Wesley was a wonderful horn arranger. Before I even knew about his funk history, one of my first dates in New York was a jazz date that Fred had composed, where he sounded like Fred, but it was more like a Slide Hampton date. If you hadn't known all the stuff he had done for James Brown, which at the time I didn't. But of course, Gil Evans, comes to mind, all the great stuff that he did with Miles, and I had the pleasure of playing with him many times in New York. So I'd have to put him up there. And another favorite of mine, as far as horn section writing, and this is section stuff, but he was just great, was the great Bernie Worrell, who wrote for George Clinton, Parliament Funkadelic. He was a really trained musician, knew everything about counterpoint voicings, placing horns as a part of the rhythm section. One of my favorite tunes is Handcuffs, which he arranged and I luckily played on with Maceo and Fred. So those guys were just great. And of course, Duke Ellington and all the great big bands, what can you say, Neil Hefti, Ernie Wilkins. Once again, there's 300 guys. I'm just talking off the top of my head.
Here's a fun question. If you could have performed with anyone in history that you hadn't performed with, who would it be?
It would be Sonny Rollins, because I met him several times, would go hear him multitude of times, but I always thought I would have a great affinity with him because he plays so compositionally and he plays off the top of his head. Of course, he knows the changes, but he likes to just take chances and go wild. One of my favorite records is Sonny Meets Hawk, and I would have loved to have had a good shot at playing with Sonny, and I never got that chance. Played with Bob Crenshaw a million times as bass player, but never Sonny.
That actually ties to, I have a double question, and you kind of, I guess, I don't know if that answered it, but what is your biggest regret in music, and what is your proudest musical moment?
Well, let me see. I don't know if I have any regrets. At the time, I had a regret that this is not going to be probably a popular answer or whatever, but I did have regret that I left Blood, Sweat, and Tears when I did at the moment, because I left to join Horace Silver, which was a thrill, but I left with them saying, please don't leave. We're cutting everyone in equally. Everybody's going to make the same money. We have a new singer, David Clayton Thomas, and you're not going to be a sideman like you were, because I was played salary. I played on the first Blood, Sweat, and Tears record. And I said, no, look, I think I really need to play. I'm going to go off with Horace. He's paying $250 a week, and you guys are only paying me $100, whether we worked or not, though. Anyway, they went in the studio and they recorded their second album. I got my friend Lou Soloff to replace me begrudgingly. He didn't really want to do it. I said, just try it out for a couple of weeks because I'm in a spot. And they recorded things like And When I Die and Spinning Wheel, and their record sold 11 million copies, was number one. Their salaries went up to $5,000 a week. Horace, out of my $250, took taxes out. That left $147.50. And I had to pay my hotel. He left that out of the. So sorry, but that at the time might have been my biggest regret. But it's funny how things work out. It worked out great in the end.
All right, so we have our final question.
Your
proudest musical moment as well.
Again, I said, I guess the thing I'm proudest of having done, I think, is start what became known as the Brecker Brothers Band and all the things that came after that, and writing on the first Brecker Brothers record and producing that. I had a real clear conception as far as what I wanted. It was originally supposed to be a solo record, but we had gotten signed by Clive Davis, great guy in the business. Starting a new record label was a great opportunity, but he insisted, instead of me calling it the Randy Brecker solo record, I had to call it the Brecker Brothers. And at first I persisted in saying, no, I've worked really hard on this music, and Sanborn's there. It's going to look funny. It's going to be three guys in the front line. So it's going to look funny. But it was such a nice opportunity, and the rest was history.
Our final question is, because we're very focused on music education here on the show, if you could change music education, what reforms would you put in, or what would you change?
Oh, boy, now that's a hard one, because I'm a fan of music education, though quite often it gets a bad rap. The only thing that I might change is for the most part, it's probably there. I would emphasize trying to find, subconsciously without overthinking it, try to eventually find your own voice and have more emphasis on using your ear rather than a lot of rules. I mean, the one time I went to Berkeley in the summer when I was a kid, I did learn something, but there were all these, and things might, I'm sure, have changed a lot since then. But the teacher was always spewing out rules and rule this, you got to do this when it's that, and I would leave it open for more creative input, so to speak. But I'm not one to put down or find really anything that wrong with jazz education. There's so many young players coming out that just play great in all different styles, and pop music, I think, is in a good place where the instrumentalists from going to school play better. If you look back at when I was coming up, I mean, there were individualists, but when you look closer, some of the musicianship was kind of lacking. It was nice. If you listen to Janis Joplin's band, they probably only knew 3 chords. Now you hear bands that really can play because they know what they're doing. So it's a long answer, but my basic thing is just keep doing what you're doing in jazz education, but have guys try to start bands early. The guys I met when I was 15, if they were still here, I'd be associated with all of them. But the guys are here. I still going to Japan with Sanborn in a couple months. All these years later, we're still feel at most home with each other.
Fantastic. And actually that leads to, do you want to mention any upcoming shows for the rest of the year and any upcoming projects? You mentioned your album with your wife. Oh,
yeah. Okay, well, there's 2. I'll be on the road for a couple months with Billy Cobham, celebrating his 75th birthday, and the album Crosswinds, which we did back in 1974, and we leave next week. Well, we're playing in New York at the Blue Note, and then a cross-country tour, and he has plans for next year for maybe a co-led thing, pianoless sextet, so keeping that in the fire. Also, I have a future project coming out with Eric Marienthal. We're co-leading a record where we both contributed some tunes, and George Woody, who is my good friend and who played in Brecker Brothers as a producer and keyboard artist, is behind the scenes helping put it all together. That'll be out sometime later next year. But the immediate thing is the album I just did with my wife, which is one of the, I think, the best things I've ever done as far as listenability. She wrote really 10 lovely, different, melodically oriented tunes, which is the way I like it. And we had a great band. It's called Brecker Plays Ravati's Sacred Bond, referring to the sacred bond between mother and daughter. We have a 10-year-old daughter, Stella, who actually sings one tune on the record with Ada, my wife, in octaves, the opening tune, which is called Sacred Bond. So keep an eye out for that, too.
Well, the great Randy Brecker, thank you so much for coming on the show. And it was such a thrill for both of us to be able to talk to you. I really hope you enjoyed the interview, and I really hope you'll come back again soon.
Well, I hope so. You did really well. You guys know what you're doing, and just keep it up. We need you guys.
Thank you so much for listening to this interview. I'm so honored to be able to talk to all of my guests. They are the best in the business. If you enjoyed the show, I'd really appreciate if you shared it on social media and hit subscribe for future guests. Check out NikhilHogan.com for updates on my upcoming book, Why Children Quit Music, and check out SongbbirdMusicAcademy.com for free resources on how to learn music. Thanks again, and I'll see you at the next show.